So, my name is Corey, and welcome to Planet Connected, an Eclipse video series exploring where science, education, and community meet. In our climate talks, we speak with researchers, scientists, educators, and policymakers about what we are learning from a changing climate and what it means for education in our communities. Today, we're joined by Dr. Jane Baldwin, an assistant professor in the Department of Earth System Sciences at University of California, Irvine.
And I'm Asli Sezen-Barrie, Faculty Director of ECLPS and Professor at UC Irvine School of Education. My work explores the role of education and what it can do in understanding and responding to climate and environmental challenges. And I'll give it over to Jane right now.
Hi, my name's Jane Baldwin. As Corinna said, I'm an assistant professor of Earth System Science at University of California, Irvine. I'm an atmospheric scientist and climate modeler by training. I do a lot of research on extreme events like heat waves and hurricanes, how they're changing with climate change, and what the impacts they might have on society are.
Great. We're happy to have you here, Jane.
Alrighty.
Very happy
Yes,
to be
thank you
here.
for speaking with us today. I'll go on to our first question, which is we've been experiencing more frequent and intense periods of extreme heat, including humid heat. And I'm curious to know what is driving these changes, and what do you think educators and young people should understand about the connections among climate change, temperature, and humidity?
Yeah, so as levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere rise, that has effectively a blanketing effect on the Earth and it warms the mean temperature of the Earth. And so, to first order, when that mean temperature increases, you can think about the whole range of variability of temperatures we typically experience is just shifted up a little bit. So, those most extreme temperatures that we've seen in the historical period are going to be that much warmer in the future. And we've already seen these changes. This isn't just something we're expecting to happen by, the end of the 21st century, say. There's strong evidence that over, the past 20 years or so, we've already seen increasing trends in the frequency of extremely hot days and heat waves, for example. Now, humid heat is of particular concern for human health because humans cool themselves in large part by sweating. So basically, when the humidity, the amount of moisture in the atmosphere is higher, that makes it harder for the human body to cool itself by sweating. That sweat has to evaporate from the skin. And when the humidity is higher, it basically makes it harder for that sweat to effectively evaporate from the skin. So humid heat presents sort of a double whammy for heat stress on the human body. Now, I just said that temperature of the earth increases with climate change, but we also have reason to expect that the amount of moisture in the atmosphere also increases with climate change. This is due to a fundamental kind of thermodynamic, meaning like basic physical relationship called the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, which complicated name, but it basically just says that as the atmosphere gets warmer, we can have more water in the atmosphere in a vapor state. So the humidity of the atmosphere increases. So we have strong reason to believe that not just dry heat, but also humid heat should increase with warming. The exact patterns of how that will change across space are something we're still figuring out. Like, for example, how will a relatively dry place like Southern California change compared to a moister place like the Gulf Coast? However, all else being equal, we do expect humid heat to increase as well.
Great. And Jane and Dr. Baldwin, I should say, is that uh like I know you have some connection to East Coast, and that's where I spend most of my time in the US too, where we actually started really feeling the effects of humidity and humid heat. And this summer, I was actually, realizing some of the summer days where there's increased amounts of humidity summer months, and then even like some of my plants were not happy about it. So I guess like I was wondering, when you do your work, do you look at data like across different uh, geographies, or do you have a specific location that you explore recently?
That's a great question. So I'm trained primarily as what's called a global climate modeler. So basically, the models I run that represent the climate system are typically global in nature, and there's good reason for that. It's because there are wave patterns that actually traverse the entire atmosphere, so it's hard to kind of model just one part of the atmosphere. However, often when I'm thinking about impacts, I need to hone in on a more particular region, like just what's going to happen to the US or what's going to happen to the tropics, which is a place where people are already experience very high heat and it might get worse. And the reality is there are different kind of physical mechanisms that control, say, heat if you're in more mid-latitude areas like the US versus tropical regions. When it comes to thinking about not just so in my field we use the term hazard to refer to just say the temperature, the humidity, what's actually happening with the atmosphere itself. And we use the term impacts to or risk to think about, okay, what's the whole connection between the hazard, vulnerability, exposure to like what's actually happening to people or buildings or something on the ground. And that work needs to be a lot more interdisciplinary. So typically I'm collaborating with, say, health researchers in doing that work. And health data is can be really hard to come by. So often we're working with, say, data from a particular city or a collection of cities, wherever my health collaborator has managed to get information. A different way of thinking about impacts, though, is I sometimes collaborate with physiologists who put people in what are called thermal chambers. It's basically like a really hot room where they can vary the temperature and humidity and see how the human body responds. And they can kind of develop, like I develop climate models, they can develop a model of how the human body responds to temperature and humidity. And so sometimes we're thinking about like actual health outcomes on the ground, like how many people perished in different heat waves. And sometimes we're thinking more about what would the idealized human body do in response to heat.
That's great. I do want to highlight a couple of things from what you just said for educators. One, you highlighted that interdisciplinarity. I know that, schools have their, earth science and weather climate units, but they do also have health science unit. So it would be great if teachers can actually do, like have a phenomena related to humidity or humid temperatures and basically thread that across both health sciences and their maybe earth science or weather climate units. And the other thing that you mentioned, like the importance of understanding global mechanism to
Mm,
sometimes understand the hazard that's happening locally. Like we do find a lot of value on creating local scientific phenomena for our students, but at the same time, there's some parts of that how it works, how we got here. It's also important to have that global data as well. So I just wanted to plug in here for educators for getting into this and trying to understand how to best look at these phenomena that their students, just like us, they're also experiencing in their neighborhoods.
yeah, yeah. A great, very present example of kind of the global bridging to the local is we're expecting a really strong El Nino this year, meaning like really warm Pacific sea surface temperatures. And that's really a global physical phenomenon, but it has huge regional impacts. I mean, this is something that my collaborators who study regional fire risk in California are really thinking about right now, similar to other collaborators I have who think about hurricane risk along the Gulf Coast. These are both kind of situations where, you can't study what's happening regionally in isolation. There's, some utility in understanding the global climate and then using it to hone in on what's happening regionally as well.
Yep, great. I'm gonna turn to Corey for the next
Yeah.
question, which is kind of a bridge, I guess, to what we were just talking about.
Um, I was just gonna say I really thought it was interesting what you're saying about the impacts on both the human body and also the health outcomes that you are measuring. And I'm interested in hearing as well how we can convey these impacts to students and what impacts of extreme heat educators should help students recognize. So how do you think teachers could use students' local experiences or observations or community data to make learning about extreme heat meaningful and relevant to them?
Yeah, so there are a variety of different kind of impacts from the heat that we think about. One like hyper-local idea is actually a lot of schools' athletic programs have to think carefully about heat when they're planning practices. So, for example, kind of the gold standard for athletic programs is that they have something called a wet bulb globe thermometer, and they use it to assess whether conditions are too hot to hold practice or if students need more breaks, for example. So, one thing that could be interesting is for students to investigate what, say, national recommendations are for holding sports practices in the heat, then maybe talk to athletic trainers about their school and see what they do on the ground. So, that's kind of thinking about the impacts of heat, national policy and recommendations versus what is necessary on the ground. And, hopefully this won't lead to students saying it's too hot, we can't do practice at all, but it's a real impact from the heat. And I was part of a study that actually surveyed a bunch of athletic coaches and trainers in Texas about how they deal with the heat. And this is something that coaches and trainers are really thinking about. And a wet bulb globe thermometer, just for reference, it's a device that measures not just temperature and humidity, but also the amount of radiation that's coming in, because how much sunlight there is can really affect the heat you experience. Another impact we think about a lot is and it's obviously the worst impact from the heat, but people actually perishing in the heat. This is more likely to occur if people are elderly or sick. And so thinking about the good news is that a lot of heat related death and illness is really preventable. So something students can think about is what are things they can do to help people around them or their family when it's really hot out. So, for example, really simple things like you should make sure you hydrate, you should try to open your windows, and if you have an air conditioner, use it when it's really hot out. But maybe they have an elderly neighbor, and maybe in the next heat wave, they want to kind of just check in on them and see if they can bring them some cold water or help them open a window or something. There are actually studies in France after they had a major heat wave. They instituted kind of a neighbor to neighbor watch program, and it significantly lowered the mortality of subsequent heat waves. And then another impact that's kind of interesting for students to think about is on sort of occupational labor. So people who need to work outdoors in the heat. California actually is one of the few places in America that has a rigorous occupational heat stress policy, where basically when temperature is above a certain level, employers are supposed to allow their workers to have water breaks. So something that students could do is look into what are the actual occupational heat policies in California and maybe track using a thermometer in their classroom when they're exceeding those thresholds, and maybe go outside and experience the heat themselves and think, would I be able to work outside in this temperature, if I just had some water breaks or not. That's something actually that it's kind of surprising, but America does not have a national standard for occupational heat. So it's interesting for students to think about that as well. And then, temperature and humidity are things that are pretty easy to measure. Again, a wet bulb globe thermometer, which they come in a variety of prices. There are some relatively cheap ones you can buy on Amazon. There are more expensive ones, but they can be a really interesting device for students to play around with, because you can see, oh, the heat stress you'd experience if you put it in the sun versus the shade is going to be very different. So that's kind of a variety of ideas that you can begin to think about the really local impacts of heat. And then the final one, I'll just say that's kind of my pet one that I think is fun, is I have a colleague who did a study of actually heat stress on playgrounds, because a lot of slides get like crazy hot in the sun. If you think about those like old metal slides, they've kind of moved away from them. So getting students to kind of investigate the surfaces on their playground and think about how hot they are on different days could also be an interesting thing to map out too.
That's great. I do remember the metal playgrounds. Corey might not, but I remember getting burned by them. And Dr. Baldwin, another thing that you mentioned with the thermometers, the wet bulb thermometers, I believe you call them, the schools can do something like where they can even put a label on, a particular day when the humidity was really high. So there's an historic measure that when students are collecting current data, they can also look at, maybe there was one year the students measured this, really high humidity, and then they can actually kind of like have that as part of their school display as well.
Yeah, and local weather station data is all like publicly available. So, for example, even if you're, sometimes schools have their own like little weather station someone has set up. But even if you don't, say if you're in Orange County, I'm sure you can download data from the local Santa Ana airport that goes back a number of years. Maybe downloading it would take a little bit of figuring out. It's not very complicated, but then it's essentially an Excel table that you could have students plot some points or make some simple plots with yourself and look at too.
Definitely. And there are, I actually did a project where we looked at extreme weather in Mount Washington in New Hampshire, where
Oh,
this
cool.
were like wind speed and,
Cool.
and also like temperature, but different than humidity. And students were able to were able to receive the NOAA data and put it in a code app, which makes it like easier platform for middle school students to work on. There are a couple, different platforms like that that teachers can actually be able to access these large data sets and then make it kind of like middle school or high school friendly for their students to work on. But these
That's
are great ideas. Yeah, sorry. You did give us really good ideas.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think they're really interesting ideas that you brought up. And especially from the student perspective, someone, who has gone through like the education system, I think it would have been really helpful to have some of those like lessons brought up in my class that you mentioned. The next question that I had is kind of also thinking from the student perspective, these trends are very serious and we want to see young people responding as well and see where they can, take action. And I'm interested in hearing what ways you see students like me or other young people take practical action or community responses they can have or scientific developments that may give them hope. And how can educators help students develop a sense of informed hope and agency rather than just simply feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as someone who studies climate change, I think about this every day. I think that, something I like about heat as an extreme event is there are a lot, and I alluded to this in some of my prior answers, but there are a lot of things you can do to prevent impacts from heat, right? And this is something I'm saying, again, I'm a climate scientist, but the public health researchers I work with, who I really respect, they'll often say, most heat illness is preventable with relatively simple interventions. So I think students, most locations have a heat warning system. Some of them are more locally tailored than others. Some people just use the National Weather Service standards. Other places have like their own locally tailored heat warning system. Might be interesting for students to look into how the one that their local weather station uses is created. But in any case, if students can pay attention to when heat warnings are in place and try to make sure their family is taking appropriate precautions, as I said, if they have neighbors around them who are maybe elderly or sick, just checking in on them can make a big difference. I think, a lot of heat stroke that like heat stroke during athletic events is a real thing. So being aware of appropriate precautions to take in terms of hydration, there are all sorts of different ways to cool yourself down that, a lot of sports teams practice, like putting ice on. I was very hot this weekend, and my husband, who played football in high school, was like, put ice like by your neck and like on your, like little practices like that, I think can really make a real difference. So, obviously, as a global problem, we need to reduce the amount of carbon emissions we're producing to deal with climate change. But that and voting, advocacy. There are plenty of ways that students can be responsible citizens towards that. However, I think in terms of dealing with heat on the ground, being an informed citizen about what the risks of heat are, who the most vulnerable populations are, making sure people in their family and themselves are taking appropriate precautions, and then trying to help those around them are all like really useful things that can be done that, maybe the vast majority of the time are just going to nudge the needle a little bit, but every once in a while you might be the difference between someone, needing to go to the hospital in the heat versus being fine. I'm very pregnant right now, and I can tell you as a pregnant person, you're much more vulnerable to the heat. So, I've been having to lean on family members to help out when I need to do something outside, for example, in the middle of the summer. So, kind of small things like that can make a big difference. Other things that are kind of stepping it up a level, but as I mentioned, talking to your athletic trainer's office about what their policies are for heat in sports, and trying to like get people thinking about that, because as the climate continues to warm, we're just going to see more and more extremely hot days. So maybe policies that were fine in the past need to be revised in light of that. And I think similarly, we can think about more at the city scale. Like there are all sorts of kind of urban interventions in terms of green space or white roofs that, I think are candidly as a physical scientist, it's a little bit hard to quantify exactly how much of a difference some of these interventions make for the heat. However, no matter what, green space often improves people's quality of life. So if students want to get more civically uh, uh, engaged, those are kind of things within their town they can advocate for. They're probably going to help mitigate the heat to some degree, and also might improve people's quality of life as well. So anyway, I think there's a plethora of things that students can do depending on their interests to help advocate for kind of safer conditions in the heat, while also keeping in mind that, being an informed citizen and thinking about what national and global policies should be, which first and foremost means voting for people who are going to support appropriate policies, is kind of the other scale of things.
Yeah, and one of the things I can also plug in here, there's an outdoor campaign that they're just moving a bill in California where they're trying to have more shade on schoolyards and
Oh,
learning
cool.
spaces that can kind of like increase even with the existing, the problem that we're facing on increasing hot days where students can still have, increased amount of time that they can spend outside. So that's like, that became also through kind of advocating and showing evidence that spending time or learning outdoors actually are healthier for us. And this, as you said, like there are things we can do to prevent the heat illness. I think that was the big hope that I take in the conditions that we live in. But I completely agree with you that it is a big scale global problem, and there are definitely ways that we can take action to reduce the carbon emissions, and that then hopefully at some point in the future we're going to be reducing some of the impacts of these issues that we're facing today. But great, really enjoyed all your recommendations, and the hope that you left with us, and things that actionable items that we can do, schools can do, educators can do. And
Yeah, absolutely.
is there anything else you want to add before we finish, Dr. Baldwin, before I move to Corey? Any message?
Um, well, maybe on the point of interdisciplinarity, which you brought up, Asli, I think, when I was in school, in middle school and high school, I very much thought of kind of you're a physics or math person, you're maybe a biology person, you're an English person, and the farther I get along in kind of my academic career, the more the lines kind of have to be blurred. So I think and I don't know, but I think if maybe I had known that when I was younger, it would have changed my perspective of things. So I think, I'm not I educate college students. I'm not a K through 12 educator myself, but I feel like that is a cool idea that, heat, as an example, you can think about it as a physical hazard that, you're thinking about the atmospheric waves and pressure patterns that lead to heat, interactions with how dry the surface is. You can think about it from a health impacts perspective and kind of more the biology of the human body. And you can think about it from sort of a social science perspective about, policies we have and what the barriers have been to like putting different policies in place in different states and across the nation. And so I think and all of those kind of intersect together to what is the heat risk we actually experience. So that kind of like interdisciplinarity is something that I have found very engaging as a researcher and maybe would be motivating to students who might not otherwise identify as, oh, I'm a physics math person or something like that. It might engage them in it. So yeah.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Thank you. I was definitely thinking from my perspective as well, where I came into college just thinking I'm a humanities person, I'm a writer. But, as I explore more, I realize that things can definitely overlap. And there's definitely so many other interests and things that I'm realizing I can study and pursue as well that also relate to my interest in the humanities and writing. So I really appreciate you coming out and joining us today and helping us better understand your work and its implications for education. And thank you to everyone for watching Planet Connected. Through these conversations, we hope to connect science, education, and community perspectives as we think together about flourishing futures in a changing climate. Um, and for everyone listening, feel free to follow Eclipse on Instagram at Eclipse1 or LinkedIn for more Planet Connected climate talks and future conversations.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Dr. Baldwin.
Thanks, Dr. Sezen-Barrie and Corinna.